This video is about Rosa Luxemburg, our second socialist key thinker for paper 3, Political Ideas. And as usual, before we talk about her views on human nature, state, society and economy, we'll talk a little bit about her and her background. So Rosa Luxemburg was actually born in Poland, but becomes a German citizen and dies in Germany in 1919. She's born into a secular Jewish family, which is similar but different to Marx in that the family would recognise and commemorate important dates in the Jewish calendar, but wouldn't necessarily practice the religion. Remember that Marx came from a Jewish family that was non-religious, and actually the father converted to the Protestant faith. Marx himself referred to religion as the opium of the masses. And the reason why I'm stressing this is because the anti-Semitism, particularly of the Second World War and the Hitler regime, made a link between Judaism and communism, what he called Jewish Bolshevism. And that's because Hitler would have pointed to many leading socialists, past and present, and make links between their Jewishness and being communists. And that's something that I want to sort of provide a disclaimer to, because although Rosa Luxemburg's family were Jewish in terms of their culture, they were not practicing the religion. She's a disciple of Marx, so a lot of her ideas are very similar to Marx's. And she lives at the time of the Soviet Union, but opposed Lenin, and I'll explain why briefly now. So you would think that somebody like Rosa Luxemburg, who thinks that revolution is necessary, would be glad to have seen a revolution take place in Russia. But actually that's not the case. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, he writes a list in the final chapter of all of the states where communism is supposedly around the corner. The revolution for Marx and Engels was supposed to happen in England. He doesn't even mention Russia, because Russia at this point, the mid 1800s, hadn't industrialized, and so for Marx it wasn't ready. It hadn't reached that peak exploitation. So Luxemburg looks over to what Lenin is doing over in Russia, and she sees a totalitarian state. She doesn't think it's communism whatsoever. She thinks it's more akin to totalitarianism. And so, although she's a Marxist, she opposes what Lenin is doing after the Russian Revolution. She opposed the First World War as well, like many Marxists did. She saw the First World War as the proletariat of one country being asked to fight the proletariat of another country upon the orders of the bourgeoisie. And so remember that Marx had said that the working man has no nation. For socialists, the key distinguishing feature of human beings wasn't where they were from, it wasn't their nationhood, it was their social class. In 1916, she founds the Spartacus League, and that's because whenever this group are writing open letters in opposition to the war, they sign it off Spartacus. So, what is Rosa Luxemburg urging Germans to do during the First World War? She's asking trade unions to orchestrate a general strike, not just to bring about necessarily the end of the war effort, but bring about the end of the liberal state. And we'll come on to later how her view of strike action is able to show a key difference to Marx. After the end of the war, she leads the failed Spartacist uprising in January 1919. And in her own words, the purpose of that revolution was to set about destroying capitalism once and for all. That uprising fails. Luxemburg believes that she lives in a time of revolution, and even the night before her execution, she's talking about how the revolution and the people will rise again. But on the 11th of the 11th of January, the Spartacist uprising fails in Berlin. And a group known as the Freikorps, which were essentially former German soldiers signing up to fight as mercenaries under the instruction of the state, they put down the uprising. Luxemburg and her lover Karl Liebknecht are both imprisoned on the 15th of January. They are both tortured and they are both executed. Luxemburg is not treated with the same level of respect as Liebknecht is, and some have suggested that that is an act of anti-Semitism. Rosa Luxemburg was hit with a rifle butt, shot in the back of her head and thrown in a canal, whereas Liebknecht was given the honour, shall we say, of the firing squad. But the night before she died, she wrote, "The masses are the crucial factor. They are the rock on which the ultimate victory of the revolution will be built." So Luxemburg, even though she knew that her own effort had failed and her own life was about to come to quite a grisly end, she believed that she lived in a time of revolution and the revolution still would come. So let's have a look at how Rosa Luxemburg views those key concepts. We'll start with the economy like we did for Marx. What you're going to find, because Luxemburg is sort of a disciple of Marx and his ideas, is you're going to see only subtle differences, which means that in 9 markers, providing a direct comparison between Marx and Engels and Luxemburg can be quite difficult to do. So, Luxemburg and the economy. She agreed largely with Marx that capitalism was destructive and based on exploitation of the worker and needed and to be and would be replaced. But one thing that Luxemburg identified in opposition to Marx is she felt that capitalism was more resilient and adaptive than Marx did. Marx thought that industrial capitalism would reach a stage where the revolution became inevitable. But Luxemburg, for 2 reasons, didn't buy into that theory. The first is that she thought that capitalism was able to adapt in ways that Marx hadn't appreciated, and that would have prolonged the misery of the proletariat, because the longer capitalism is in place, the longer the proletariat will be exploited. The other reason for Luxemburg to sort of bring about revolution is every day that capitalism exists is a day of the exploitation of the worker. And so that exploitation should come to an end as soon as possible. So for Luxemburg, strike action could bring about class consciousness. We shouldn't just wait for class consciousness to be achieved in the way that Marx and Engels advocated. Luxemburg believes that we could actually bring about that change by strike action, that the trade unions could go on a general strike, bring the country to a halt and bring about class consciousness. And that brings us on to human nature. So remember that for human nature, Marx and Engels had argued that we had been contaminated by capitalism. But one important contradiction that Luxemburg identifies is this idea that subcultures exist. So for Luxemburg, the proletariat haven't completely bought into bourgeois values. So the idea that revolution will bring about this class consciousness, for Luxemburg, she believes that class consciousness, to an extent, already exists, that there is a different culture, there is a different set of values, that there is fraternity and community within the proletariat, that the working class communities did look out for each other, they did have a sense of brotherhood and charity and working together collectively. So Luxemburg didn't think that capitalism had damaged the proletariat in its views and its outlook on the world to the same extent than it had for the bourgeoisie, because that those qualities that we have, fraternity and altruism, are still flourishing within a proletarian community. Okay, that brings us to society. I've used the word proletariat and bourgeoisie a lot there, so let's move on to society and social class. It is morally indefensible, according to Luxemburg, for society to be split in the way that it is between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the haves and the have-nots. But for Luxemburg, within that proletariat community, there is subculture. And it's linked to what we were saying there earlier about human nature and this idea that ideas persist despite capitalism. So, again, there is a very slight difference to Marx there. Yes, society is split between the haves and the have-nots, and yes, it is still wrong for that to be the case. However, and the big change for Luxemburg is there is a subculture within the proletariat which thrives and continues to exist despite capitalism. And then finally, we're moving on to the state. So for Luxemburg, she is buying into revolution. She is our second of two revolutionary socialists. She believed that capitalism and its end could be brought about through revolution. However, strike action can sort of limit the amount of damage that's done to the proletariat. And what we mean by this is, in Marx's version of waiting for the revolution, class consciousness will be achieved eventually. But capitalism will get more and more exploitative. That's more pain, more exploitation, more poverty, more hardship with every day that we are waiting for that revolution to come. Luxemburg believes that she lived in the age of revolution, a time of revolution, that the world was turned upside down by this First World War. And she believed that those who had achieved a sense of consciousness before others could bring it about. They could host a general strike. They could bring the country down to its knees, and the strike action would destroy the existing state. Another interesting thing for Luxemburg, and you'll see this in a lot of her writing, is she is very concerned about freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And I'm going to misquote her here, but at some point she's speculating about what freedom means, and she says, your freedom is defined by how free your opponent is. Luxemburg was very much looking over at what was happening in Russia after the revolution. What she saw was a totalitarian regime and the suppression of freedom of thought. It was Lenin's way or not at all. Whereas for Luxemburg, she wanted to embrace those diverse ideas, those different ways of thinking. And so for Luxemburg, the socialist state can be one that has free speech and free elections, which sounds strange for a revolutionary socialist to say, because for her there will be a revolution and it will replace the existing capitalist state. But socialism can be a genuine democracy with freedom in terms of elections and freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which is quite a twist, quite a change from Marx.